Hi, welcome everyone. First, I'd like to express my thanks to all of you for joining us in this special meeting sponsored by SUACONA. We are gathered here to understand and reject the Reclamation project as presented to us by our audacious Mayor Remolio. We would like to have this time for discernment. Let us not lose hope. We should not allow the beautiful Dumaguete and our ecosystem to be wrecked or ruined, especially by the foreign nationals. God built this city for us, and we should preserve it. Thank you, Jojo, Moses, Luella, and our esteemed speakers for joining us tonight and, of course, morning in the Philippines. Welcome again. Thank you.
Okay, my turn. So I must admit that this was supposed to be initially planned for just Suwakona chapter members, alumni members in the States. But because of the interest that this issue has caused, there's many people outside of Suwakona that would like to join us in this. I would call it forum by now. We will have, by the way, a longer Q&A period after the four speakers in the panel are finished with their presentations. Um, we have four speakers tonight, and these are experts in their field. We have Golda Benjamin, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, especially if you have a Facebook account. Um, for those who are not familiar, Golda obtained her law degree from the University of the Philippines. She is a professor in the Silliman University College of Law. She is also a program director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is an international nonprofit organization based in London. Um, as many of you probably know, Golda has been tirelessly working on this from the start, and she has examined all the legal procedures, questionable procedures, in fact, that were taken, that were done by the council and the mayor, and she will present to us step by step in chronology as to how this came about from the legal point of view, and of course, she will include some of her opinions as she goes along. We have given her the most time allotted for this, while all the other three speakers are only going to have 10 minutes each so that we can spend more time with the Q&A. Luella is the next speaker. She's a marine biologist um, from the University of San Diego. She is currently a adjunct professor at Silliman um, Institute of Environment and Marine Sciences, which is also known as the SU Marine Lab. She is an expert on marine mammals, dolphins and whales, and their ecology. In fact, she pioneered the dolphin and whale research in the Philippines in the late 1980s and is responsible for the formulation of the first Philippine laws to protect these marine mammals. Luella is also our chairman of the newly formed Suacona Environmental Committee. The third speaker will be myself. As you probably know me, I am a geologist. I am a hydrogeologist and an environmental geologist. Have some professional geology licenses in the States and a licensed site remediation professional license in New Jersey. I have been involved with the 1999-2002 reclamation issue, and I'm glad to say that because of our work together with many of the organizations that supported the university remains beside the sea. Jenny Lind is our last speaker. Um, she is a lawyer and she is a judge at the Supreme Court, and it's the she has the position of Deputy Court Administrator for the Visayan region. She is also the president of the current president of the SAAI, Silliman Alumni Association, Inc. She is passionate about this issue, and she is also the um, she. I'm sorry. Her lifelong motto is to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason. So, without further ado, first speaker, Golda.
Thank you, Moses. And I'm just going to wait for my slides to come up. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today. It's very cold in the Philippines. All right, I can see my slides now. So I'll just give a little bit of background how I became involved in this case. I have a very busy day job, but it was just very coincidental that a day after the hearing where the council approved the authority of the mayor to sign this contract, 3 people sent me links to the session and just asked me very casually if what the council did was legal. And so I started looking at the company. I immediately ordered for the Securities and Exchange Commission papers of this EM Cuerpo. I started reading our PPP ordinance and rules and discovered many, many things, and things started to unravel. So I could not bear not being active in this issue. And so I'm going to start. So I always want to call this the 174-hectare unsolicited reclaimed island because we never planned for this. This is not part of Dumaguete's comprehensive development plan. So next slide, please. And I have shared the link to my presentation. So if you want to look at it from your own screens, and if you want to share it with your families and friends, you may also do that. You're welcome to do that. So I'm going to start with a description of the project so you know what we're talking about. And then I will discuss the lack of consultations, how that came about, and then why we think EM Cuerpo here is an unqualified contractor. Then I'll briefly go through disadvantageous provisions and of course what we can do. I don't have time to discuss all the disadvantageous provisions, so I'm just going to limit it to 4. Next slide. So this is what our mayor wants to do for our beautiful city. He wants to build an island, that white part on the screen. He wants to build 2 islands that will cover, I think, approximately 85% of our entire coastline. So all of us are from Dumaguete. It will start in Bantayan, conveniently covered Silliman Beach, and conveniently covered Rizal Boulevard and the Silliman campus. I think because he was hoping that the Sillimanians would shut up because he frees the coastlines of things that we value. Unfortunately, he's wrong. So that's about 85% of our coastline. Now, on the next slide is the first major issue and that's why the scientists spoke up first, actually, and released the first position paper, because the area will hit at least 4 marine protected areas. And these are areas that are protected via an ordinance. And these ordinances were highly debated in our council, and so many people have worked so hard. I think at least one of the marine protected area we've been taking care of as a community for at least 2 decades. So that would be the MPA of Bantayan to the rightmost part of your screen. And then of course, Look, and then Mangnao, and then Banilan. So that alone, the irreversible damage that this project will have on these marine protected areas, it's just terrible that the mayor thinks that this is perfectly okay. In terms of data and statistics, we have about 994 fisher folks in Dumaguete. Now we multiply that to the number of families affected if these marine protected areas will be pulverized by this project. And same, of course, with some of us who also depend on the fish that these fisher folks do catch on a daily basis. So next slide. So I'm just going to walk through very briefly because this is also a source of the confusion. This is the process in the Dumaguete City Ordinance. The first stage is that all PPP contracts must be signed by the city mayor with prior authorization by the Sangguniang Panlunsod through a resolution. And it's definite that we already have a PPP contract. Our mayor is trying to argue that what we have is a mere joint venture agreement. Unfortunately, I disagree with him because we already went through 2 years of negotiations. We went through an unsolicited proposal negotiation. We went through Swiss Challenge, even published it in a major daily. And of course, our PPP selection committee already awarded this contract. So it is quite preposterous that suddenly something that was presented as a joint venture agreement, negotiated as a joint venture agreement, awarded as a joint venture agreement, is now suddenly called a memorandum of agreement. So that is just preposterous. It has no basis in law. It has no basis in our own ordinance. And it has no basis actually in the document itself. So this is the stage where we are right now. The council was supposed to submit a resolution, pass a resolution, giving the mayor authority to sign this contract. And they did. Last hearing, they did, unfortunately, with a very close 6-5 vote. But at least for now, we shouldn't worry too much first because the memorandum of agreement actually is not required to start the PRA, the Philippine Reclamation Authority process. Because of our collective protest, the council actually withdrew the resolution of no objection, which is a critical requirement for the process to start at the PRA. And because the mayor lost that vote after last hearing, then he cannot proceed. What's curious is that he's so adamant to have the authority to sign the MOA when in fact this MOA is not at all required to start the PRA process. So I'm hoping that you will answer that question soon. So after the prior authorization, I'm sorry, as a condition before the council will give a resolution to authorize the mayor to sign, our ordinance is very clear. They need to open it up first for public consultation and hearing. And we don't need to be experts in the law to understand why that's a requirement, of course, because how can we authorize our mayor to sign something as massive as a 23 billion reclamation project without hearing the people? And so this is the right that we have been deprived for 3 hearings already. And finally, only after a public consultation or hearing, will the mayor go back to the company, EM Cuerpo, sign the joint venture agreement, and then go back to the city council to have the city council approve or confirm the contract through an ordinance. So this is very basic because they are the checks and balances in our society. So they have to check whether or not our mayor signed exactly the same thing they authorized him to sign. And so in the next slide, we began to ask ourselves, so why then is the mayor saying that it is not yet time for public consultation? Well, number one, he seems to be saying that anyway, the PRA and the DENR will have their own consultations, which actually misses the point because the PRA purpose of consultation will not even look into the capacity of EM Cuerpo. It's on economic, social, and environmental acceptability. The DENR consultation, of course, will be on environment. But we know that this contract has many aspects, including the qualification. And so how did they force their way out of people participation and public hearing? The scheme was actually very simple, in fact, almost ridiculous. So on July 7, the first hearing where this contract was discussed, and I'm sorry if it's not very clear, but on the first hearing, on the left side of your screen, that's the transmittal letter of the mayor to the city council. And he called, along with his legal officer, Attorney Manuel Arbon, who ironically is unfortunately an environment law professor, one of the lawyers in Dumaguete that I very much respect. In their letter, they called this agreement a memorandum of agreement. I think they were hoping that calling it a memorandum of agreement, they could evade the clear provision in our ordinance, which says that if the council is presented a PPP contract, a draft PPP contract, then they would have to open it up to people participation and public hearing. But unfortunately for them, the document that they attached itself is entitled Draft Joint Venture Agreement. And I read through the entire document one by one. 11 times the word the phrase joint venture agreement appears, even until the section where a lawyer would notarize this document. So it is really ridiculous for them to say that this is just a mere MOA. Next slide. And I know that the sponsor himself, Attorney Michael Maxino Bandal, knew that he was presenting a draft PPP contract, because when he opened his intervention, he did say, Madam Chair, before discussing the details of this draft joint venture agreement, may I be given the time to present perhaps a short video. And then in response, Attorney Carissa Tolentino Maxino, who is the chair and our vice mayor, responded in this by using also proposed JVA. She said, were the councilors given copies of the proposed JVA prior to the session? So there's really no basis also, even in the statements of no less than the sponsors of this MOA, that this is the draft PPP contract. Next slide. And next slide. And this is just my due diligence. I looked at it and I said, there's 0 times. Can we go back to the previous slide first, Joe? So 0 times, never mentioned the MOA in the document itself, and 11 times the phrase joint venture agreement. There was only a time when the phrase MOA was used, but it was to refer to the process later on when Dumaguete and the Philippine Reclamation Authority would enter into a MOA, not the MOA between Dumaguete and EM Cuerpo. And so next slide, I presented this at the council and I asked them, why did you call something that's obviously a JVA a MOA? And I told them it's only because really, and it's no longer a debate, it's only because Mayor Remolio said so in that letter. I think it's a responsibility to be as frank and candid to our councilors, because our home and our lives and the lives of my 1-year-old are at stake here. So there's no more time to play Miss Nice Golda in the session. Next slide. And so we started, along with a lot of law volunteers, we started looking at the qualification of EM Cuerpo. And we looked at the official documents, of course, from the SEC. And we discovered that EM Cuerpo is not even a reclamation company. In fairness to EM Cuerpo, it is a quadruple A contractor. So in the Philippines, that's the best of the best. But their business is limited to smaller projects, renovations of airports, hospitals, schools. I think they did a few buildings in the University of the Philippines campus. But definitely, it's not a reclamation company. Next slide. I also looked at their own website, and they have a section on their website on completed projects, and they have a section on ongoing projects. And again, they also don't have any reclamation experience. So aside from the fact that in law, they are not authorized to do reclamation, in practice, they also are not doing reclamation activities, which leads us to this Polichangda company. Next slide. So we have in our possession a memorandum of understanding between EM Cuerpo, the company that the Dumaguete is now a partner with in the joint venture agreement, and this Polichangda. Polichangda is a state-owned Chinese company. It's quite big. They do reclamation, they do real estate, casinos all over the world, even something as glamorous as art houses where they do very expensive art auctions. So this is not your small-time Chinese mom and pop shop. Unfortunately, Polichangda is not registered in the Securities and Exchange Commission, and it also has no PCAB license, the contractor's license, which again is also required in our JVA. Even the subcontractors need to have a license. And what's suspicious is that Polichangda and EM Cuerpo already entered into this memorandum of understanding in April 2019. But EM Cuerpo only submitted their proposal to Dumaguete in November 2019. So they're really prepared to do this particular project. Next slide. So let's walk through the business model and what's their relationship. So what will happen based on the memorandum of understanding is that EM Cuerpo will sell, I apologize for the mistake on the slide, EM Cuerpo will sell its share in the reclaimed land because under the contract, they will get 49% of the 174 hectares. And so they will pay Polichangda with proceeds from the sale. And it makes sense because later on, I will show that EM Cuerpo is not financially prepared to really handle this contract. And so after paying Polichangda, Polichangda will enter Dumaguete territory and Polichangda will do the reclamation work. Based on our early due diligence, that makes sense because Polichangda really is, among its many businesses, a reclamation company as well. Next slide. And we see why this is the case because this is just a snapshot of EM Cuerpo's financial statement. I'd be happy to share it to whoever would like to request for it. I heard some students are going to put up a resource website for the critical and key documents. So I'm also happy to share that once it is launched. So if you look at this, we have to remember that this is a 23 billion project. And EM Cuerpo's net worth is only 1.4 billion. And if we have accountants here and finance experts, it's also one of the things we need from you, a bit of help also with analysis on the financial side. I have no training at all on finances. I just have a little bit of experience as one of the lawyers of the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee a few years back. So I do know how to read FS, but going a deep dive is not something that I am capable of doing. Next slide. So let's remember that EM Cuerpo is promising, with its 1.4 billion net worth, promising to build a 23 billion project, which will pay for the things on this slide. So raw land reclamation, we reached out already to some reclamation companies in Manila, and they were quite shocked because they said even at its most conservative estimate, even the raw land reclamation alone could potentially cost 15 billion already. And then this company is promising so many other things: wastewater, esplanade, modern ferry port, even the roads and bridges inside this island will be funded from the 23 billion, including power lines and this 5G smart city ready infrastructure. So we're quite dubious that this can really pay for everything. And my fear is that the 23 billion will really just pay for the raw land reclamation. We also did an initial computation of how much EM Cuerpo will be paying the PRA. And the current computation is at already 900 million. So apparently this reclamation is not going to be cheap, even if we talk about government fees. So where again would a company with 1.4 billion net worth get everything to pay for what they've promised Dumaguete and then also pay the PRA fees? So it really makes sense that a richer company is actually behind all of this. Next slide. And so I also try to explain some of the disadvantageous provisions, beginning with land, sharing in the income in the business, and then Mayor Remolio's he really is very proud that this will bring in jobs, and then waiver of taxes. So next slide. On the joint venture agreement, this is the sharing, and I had to do a screenshot to be accurate. So 49% will be PSP. PSP means the private sector proponent. This is EM Cuerpo. And 51% will be shared by the city and the Philippine Reclamation Authority. Unfortunately for Dumaguete, they agreed that 30%, well, they agreed that the roads and open spaces will be taken from the share of Dumaguete. And I looked at the PRA rules, and the PRA rule says that 30% of the total land area, which is 52.2 hectares, should be for roads and open spaces. And Dumaguete agreed that that's going to be taken from our share. So in some of the JVAs, it is actually split between the share of the company and the share of the city, but Dumaguete threw away that provision. Next, the 36.54 hectares will be divided between PRA and Dumaguete. And I think Mayor Remolio forgot that in the PRA guidelines, PRA insists on having 60% of the share of government. So we're left with a little over, I don't know, 18 hectares, and we're destroying essentially our home. So this really makes me very, very angry. Next. They're also quite proud that we will have 25% of net share in what they call ancillary businesses. Mayor Remolio in his info drive, so he's holding info drives for various sectors right now, starting with the youth in an expensive hotel with a 15 to 20,000 conference room fee. And then he's telling the people that Dumaguete will get a share in all the businesses that EM Cuerpo will establish. But he is actually not telling the truth, because the JVA just enumerates which businesses we will have a share of. And if we go down that list, they're not exactly the most profitable, like in billions. And even if they are, we will only get 25% of the share. So it's quite ridiculous that we're really throwing away everything, and then apologies, and this is simply what we're gonna get. So that's the provision in the contract. Next, let's look at this, because next slide, please. They also said that we're going to get jobs. Previous slide, please. We're going to get a lot of people working in this smart city, but unfortunately in the joint venture agreement, these are key provisions. Number one, when the project is being constructed, there is a mere preference. So letter H, if you look at the last line of letter H, Dumaguete City residents shall be given priority in the hiring of manpower. So Mayor Remolio, I have him on video, said that it will be Dumaguete City residents. All of the workers will be Dumaguete residents, and it's a mandatory provision. It is not true. It's just a priority. And I think for many of us who have been doing labor work and supporting even small businesses know that that provision in the law is often really not followed. And this provision does not even have a remedy or a liability clause should EM Cuerpo not hire Dumaguete residents. So I'm not at all comforted by a mere priority provision. Next, letter K, Dumaguete also committed to allow EM Cuerpo to bring in foreign personnel for the project. Now, if we just do a simple Google of this Pole Changda, when they have projects, for example, in Africa, in the Pacific, they bring in a plane full of their own people, because that's the way China does things. And in letter G, for the ancillary businesses that I showed everyone today, during the life of the agreement, 25 years, EM Cuerpo and Dumaguete will be co-owners of the business. But if you look at the last line in this slide, the management shall pertain to EM Cuerpo. So EM Cuerpo will be managing the businesses. And so we all know that in Philippine law, hiring and firing, deciding who to hire, rests on the manager of the business, and that will be EM Cuerpo. So if it decides to hire only Chinese workers, it can very well do that because there is no prohibition in law and neither is there a prohibition in the contract. Next slide. Mayor Remolio also says that we will have EC, income, an additional revenue. But I think he doesn't realize that Dumaguete has waived all regulatory fees and local taxes on EM Cuerpo for the construction of the project. So of course, we looked at how long will the construction take. In the joint venture agreement, it will take 3 years. And that's just for the reclamation. What if EM Cuerpo will do a staggered construction and say, oh, we're going to build building 2 and 3 on the first year, and then using that to further extend the period where they are actually, where Dumaguete would have to waive all regulatory fees and local taxes. And this is exactly how many countries fall into a debt trap. It's because of provisions like this. I can see that somebody is saying that the audio is defective. So can I please get a confirmation that others are hearing me well?
I am okay here in New York.
All right. Thank you, Maya, and thank you, Jello.
Mine in Guam.
The next provision is that it's clear in the JVA that the cities, that the EM Cuerpo will be free from real estate taxes, which makes sense because if they're not yet the owners of the land, then they don't have to pay real estate taxes, which again also brings us to another problem because the joint venture agreement allows this private company to own lands, which is, as of the moment, still prohibited by our constitution. So I don't know what they were thinking when they were drafting this particular contract. So those are the 4 major disadvantageous provisions that we should all use to counter Mayor Remolio's promises about the greatness of this contract. Next slide. On the board, I listed so far the councilors that have voted to authorize our mayor to sign this contract. So Councilor Lani Ramon, Michael Maxino Bandal, Edgar Lentorio, Sagar Barria, Patrimonio, and Amores. Michael Bandal and Edgar Lentorio are lawyers. Edgar is ironically one of my students. So I have students in both camps, those in favor and those against. And of course, Carissa Tolentino Maxino is the vice chair. She didn't vote because by default, the chair of the council, the vice mayor, has no vote. But if one of the people on the left side of your screen will switch votes and vote against this, then we would have a situation where we will have a tie. And that's where the vote of Attorney Carissa Tolentino Maxino becomes very critical. Of course, if we do political mapping, we know that Attorney Tolentino Maxino is also very, very much aligned with the mayor. So what can we do? I'd like to limit this, and this is my second to the last slide. Next slide, please. What we can do, because we're Silimanians and we're not used to fighting with each other in a way that is divisive and harsh and aggressive, I think the first thing we need to do is to reach out to the mayor and the Pro 174 councilors. If you know them personally, talk to them. I have written to the mayor. I have attempted to talk to the councilors, the Pro 174 councilors, and I'm going to continue to do that because it's important that they understand the legal, the environmental, and the economic disaster that this particular project will bring to our home. Second, provide technical analysis. I have a day job, a rather demanding day job that requires me to work virtually the entire day because of time zone issues with my teams. So we need as much help as possible, looking at the legal documents, the financial documents, I did invoke the freedom of information provisions because I wanted to get copies of the official bidding documents or the official unsolicited proposal documents. Unfortunately, they have not responded and have predictably referred my letter to the legal officer, which is quite strange because the person in possession of the document is actually the head of the PPP selection committee. But that's not something that surprised me. It's just very typical. And of course, finally, because we're in Silliman, and if you are the praying kind, and I am, I have been praying a lot for our city. I think it's important that we pray with each other, that we will survive this and that we can protect our home and that we can forever love our home despite the tension and the aggression that this issue has really brought to our quiet little Dumaguete. And finally, I'm going to leave to all of you my contact information if you have things to share with me, if you have analysis to share with me, and even materials, even articles. I've been reading them a lot so that I can also understand the technical side of things. I can understand China's foreign policy, and it helps also frame the conversation and the debate. So thank you so much, everyone. It's such an honor to be speaking to all of you from the Philippines, even if it's quite early. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Attorney Golda. And now let us proceed, and you can reserve your questions later. Let's proceed with Dr. Luella Dular, who will do her presentation.
Okay, good day, everybody. Good morning to those in the Philippines. Good evening to those in the US. In the East Coast, and good afternoon to those in San Diego. So this afternoon or tonight, I will talk about the potential impacts of the reclamation on the marine life in San Diego, in the waters of Dumaguete. Can I have the first slide, please, Jojo? Oh. Okay, so first I will talk about the coral reefs, then the seagrasses, the mangroves, and these first three habitats are the ones that will be impacted immediately, because if you dump tons of dirt on these habitats, that would immediately mean death, and it is very difficult to mitigate death. And then at the end, I will try to talk about oceanic animals, for example, the turtles and dolphins. Next slide, please. But before that, I would like to thank the students at the Institute of Environment and Marine Sciences in Silliman and those citizens who have taken photographs that I'm using during this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, this map that was shown by Attorney Benjamin earlier shows the location of those habitats in relation to the proposed reclamation area. So if you can see, the green shade there represent the seagrass, and you can see that they extend all along the coast of Dumaguete. The orange ones represent the coral reef, and again, they are distributed almost throughout the length of the coast. And the deep purple is the mangroves. Okay. Also, please take note that there is the Banica River, and the river inputs fresh water into the coastal waters, which also contribute to the richness of the area. And in this slide, you can also see the four marine protected areas in Banilad, Mangnao, Looc, and in Bantayan. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, the coral reefs in Dumaguete are alive. Estimated area is about 60 hectares, and 61% of that will be lost if this reclamation project pushes through. These are the coral reefs in Bantayan, Piapi, and also in Piapi, and they were taken very recently in just this month of July. Next slide, please. First, let's get to know the corals. So corals are animals, and each animal is called a polyp. Polyps are very small. They range in size from 1 to 3 millimeter in diameter, and they live in colonies. So if you see a coral, that would be a colony of maybe hundreds of thousands of polyps. Through the 300 million years of evolution, corals have evolved this fantastic symbiotic relationship with the algae. And just like plants, these algae have chlorophyll that can capture carbon dioxide from the water, and together with water and with the aid of sunlight, they can photosynthesize and produce food. So that's one way how these polyps obtain their food. The other way is that it can eat like an animal does. So using the tentacles, it can capture prey, like the one at the bottom there, in the bottom picture. It can capture its food and then ingest it just like any other animal. So because it can photosynthesize and because it is very much dependent on its symbiotic algae, they need to be in shallow water so they can get sunlight. So most of these corals grow in shallow waters, and most of them live in the tropics. Next slide, please. Okay, there are two kinds of corals, soft and hard corals. The hard corals are the ones that most people are acquainted with. They are capable of getting calcium from the water and deposit it and turn it into a hard skeleton made of calcium carbonate. Soft corals, on the other hand, do not have that, but they are just as equally important. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, corals grow very, very slowly. Previous slide, please. The corals grow very slowly. The massive corals, for example, the one at the right there, grow from 0.5 centimeter to 4.5 centimeter per year. So that big coral head there could be several thousand years old. The branching corals, on the other hand, grow quite a little faster, up to 10 centimeters per year. And I'd like you to look at the nooks and the crevices that are found between the branches and also under the big coral head. They provide a space to live for other marine species and also protection to them. That's why the coral reefs is considered to be the most diverse of all ecosystems at sea. Next slide, please. Next slide. And another thing I would like to point out is that each of these coral species, they have a particular requirement. So for example, those in the shallow waters can resist a little bit of sedimentation, and they need a lot of sunlight and so on. And those that are found in deeper waters, they can go with very little sunlight. And those in the middle, the reef that receives the highest amount of wave energy are called the coral heads, or the massive corals. They don't have branches because the branches would break. So each one has its own particular preferred space. So you cannot just transplant one coral to a different place. So you cannot get the corals from up close to the shore and put them at the bottom. So all the other projects that tried to do this, they did it very, very carefully, and they label each coral where it came from, what's the salinity of the previous environment, what's the slope, and so on. So it's a very complicated and very expensive procedure. And besides, the success of that procedure is yet to be seen. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so why should we protect the coral reefs? One obvious reason, of course, is because they give us food. So if they are protected and if they are treated well, 1 square kilometer of coral reef can yield up to 15 tons of fish and other products per year. They also serve as nursery and fishing grounds for many fish species, not just for the fish that live there, but also for the oceanic fish. Those of you, or the fishermen would know this, and those of you who have dived would know, or snorkeled would know, that if you go at a certain time during the morning, you can find like mamsa and all the other pelagic or oceanic fish in the reefs. So this save time and money for the fishermen. They don't have to go way out to catch this fish. All they need to do is just go fish in shallow or in the coastal waters. And if covered, we will lose all this source of food, recreation, and tourism. And also as nursery grounds, we will lose this nursery grounds. Next one, please. Next slide. Okay, coral reefs also protect our shores. They are our first line of defense against storms and flooding. This image here shows that the coral reefs can reduce the energy of the waves by 97% and its height by 84%, therefore preventing erosion and flooding. If you look at the reef crest, that's the part where there is the highest energy being reduced, about 86%. So this kind of service that coral reefs give us is usually oftentimes overlooked because it's very hard to give a cost on something that you do not pay for. For example, we do not know how much money we have saved in our electric bills during the day because there is the sun that gives us light. So it's very hard to give a value on this particular service that most of us just take for granted. However, in the later years or in the recent years, economists as well as biologists, oceanographers have worked together in order to put a dollar value on this particular service. In the US, for example, they conducted a study for over 60 years and recording the wave every hour. So it's a massive amount of data. And in 2019, they got the results out and it showed that coral reefs provide flood protection worth $1.8 billion every year. Next slide, please. Next slide. And the same group of scientists also studied 60 other different countries where there are reefs. And look, number 2 is the Philippines, the second country that can receive the most flood protection benefits from the reefs. So it has been saving and will save in the future if we keep our reefs up to 590 million US dollars or 29.7 billion pesos per year. So this is the amount of money that the Philippine government doesn't have to spend in order to avert or in order to mitigate damages created by flooding. Next slide, please. Okay, coral reefs also provide water filtration services. Majority of the sponges and corals are filter feeders, so they feed on particulate matters and they keep the water clean. For example, sponges and some corals do this. And another, can you click please, Jojo? And also coral reefs are great sources of medicine. Recent studies in the past 20 years, 15 years, they've extracted some substances from sponges, snails, sea squirts, and other organisms, and found treatments for cancer, Alzheimer's, arthritis, asthma, ulcers, heart disease, diabetes, epilepsy. And they also found a very effective and potent painkiller, better than opioids, and does not create dependence. And this is in courtesy of the Philippines because they got it from the cone shell conus textile that was found in the Philippines. Also, some coral species are used or have been used in bone grafts. Next slide, please. Okay, now let's move on to the seagrass beds. Dumaguete has close to 58 hectares of seagrass beds. 62% of this can be lost to reclamation. So why do we need to protect them? What happens if we lose them? Because if the reclamation proceeds, all this area will be dumped on, and that would be the end of these seagrass beds. So they provide food, number one. And if you look at the blade of seagrass, you can see encrusted on them different kinds of algae, different kinds of organisms, and so on that serve as food to the smaller fish, and the smaller fish become the food of the bigger, and so on and so forth. So one of our favorite products from the seagrass bed is the danggit. I'm sure everyone knows that. We even find that in our supermarkets here in the US. So aside from fish, they also produce crabs and shrimps, and they serve as nursery grounds for many fishes, crabs, and shrimps, not only for the fish that live on the seagrasses, but also the fish that live in coral reefs and also the oceanic kind. And seagrasses also protect our shorelines. They prevent erosion so that roots hold onto the sediment, holding them in place and preventing the waves to carry them away. And they also filter and purify coastal waters. They trap all the sediments that come from the rivers, that come from the land. And lastly, but very importantly, they help fight against climate change. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so 30% of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is absorbed by the ocean, and 18% of that is absorbed by the seagrass bed. So carbon dioxide is absorbed by the leaves, and then it passes that through its roots and then down to the sediments where it locks it down for thousands of years. So removing these seagrasses would actually be removing the carbon and letting them back out into the atmosphere. And scientists have found that seagrass beds actually can absorb carbon 35 times faster than tropical rainforests. And that is quite extraordinary. And also, aside from this, it has other functions. Next slide, please. Okay, they serve as our biological sentinels. What does that mean? If you take a seagrass bed and just look at what are the algae, all the other animals that live on it, and how many are they, you can have some kind of a feel or information about the health of our ecosystems, whether our corals are in trouble, whether the waters we live in are polluted, and so on. So they are our sentinels. They help us. So getting rid of them will not be very smart. Next slide, please. Okay, mangroves, just like the two other ecosystems that I mentioned, they also serve as nursery grounds for fish and other marine animals. They protect our shorelines and purify coastal waters. If you look at the picture underwater there of the mangrove, you can see that it has a very complicated root system. Those root systems protect and hold down the sediments. They also reduce the energy coming from the waves, as well at the same time serve as a habitat and food source for many juvenile fish. In Dumaguete, we have 38 hectares of mangroves, and most of them are found in Banilan. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so all these three ecosystems are actually interlinked. Damage on one ecosystem would affect the other. So as I mentioned earlier, mangroves and seagrasses serve as nursery grounds for fish, not only for the fish that live there, but also for the fish that live in the corals. The mangroves protect the sediment, protect the shoreline from the waves, and the seagrass beds trap and filter water, trap the sediments, preventing the sediments from flowing over to coral reefs and choking them. Next slide, please. So these three important ecosystems that we will lose if the reclamation project pushes through also work together in defending our properties, our coastlines. So coral reefs reduce wave energy by 97%, seagrass beds and marshes by 50%, and mangroves, this is the one that really protect us, 66%. If you remember that very strong typhoon in Tacloban, they have noticed that in areas where there are still very healthy mangroves, the damage was very low. So these are the values, these are the services that these ecosystems are giving us, but we cannot really put a value to them because we're just so used to having them. The only time we will realize their value would be the time when they're no longer there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, oceanic animals. So how would a reclamation on the coast of Dumaguete affect these oceanic animals? Well, this is a photograph of a turtle, thanks to someone who took this photograph of a turtle swimming in the coastal waters of Piapi, Bantayan boundary, and it was taken July 18. So this shows that these coastal waters of Dumaguete is a habitat for these turtles. And there have also been reports that showed that the beaches of Bantayan and also Look are the nesting grounds for these marine turtles. And sea turtles, or pawikan, have been declared as endangered by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and they are protected by our Philippine law, Republic Act 9147, otherwise called as Wildlife Resources Conservation Protection Act. And in this particular act, actually, Silliman University is acknowledged as one of the scientific authorities in marine biology or in marine ecology. Next slide, please. Okay, whales and dolphins, how can they be affected? They are oceanic, right? Well, Dumaguete and the nearby waters are very, very lucky to have 15 different species or kinds of whales and dolphins in our waters. That map to the right there is a map that I created to show the sighting density. So the darker orange shows that there are so many sightings in that area. And you can see that even in the coastal waters of Dumaguete, there's quite a high density of sightings, and not far away from it, in front of Bakong and Dawin, is a center of high density. This suggests that these areas are very important habitat for them, probably feeding or even mating, resting, and so on. And next slide, please. And so how could they be affected by the reclamation project? First of all, dolphins use sonar to find food, navigate, and communicate with each other. They create a sound, and that sound is reflected by the object in front of them, and it echoes back to them. That's how they see, so to speak, underwater. They're just like bats. So now, the continued noise, the noise that will be produced by the construction, the dredging, will mask the sound that they produce and the echo that they receive, therefore affecting their feeding, their navigation, and communication. So if this happens a period of time, say for example 3 years, that could affect their health and eventually their reproduction. Another risk comes from the dredged and fill materials. Depending on where these dredged materials come from, they can introduce pollutants into the water. Like, for example, heavy metals or toxic materials, hydrocarbons, and also organochlorides, which can enter the food chain and eventually will go into the fish and shellfish, be eaten by the dolphins, and also of us, eaten by us too. The shellfish and the fish that we eat might carry some toxic materials that could create, that could cause diseases that range from liver problems or even psychological problems. Next slide, please. So we don't only have dolphins, but we also have whales in our waters. This was cited in 2016. This is the blue whale, the pygmy blue whale, but blue whales are the largest animals on Earth. So next slide, please. I cannot think of a better complement on the marine conservation ethics and tradition in Dumaguete than a visit from this Leviathan. So there's several generations, the forefathers of Dumagueteños have left these ecosystems intact for the people of today to enjoy. So let's not be the generation to bury these ecosystems and end the privileges and the services that they have been providing to Dumaguete. So daghang salamat, and I am hopeful, and with Golda and every one of you will pray that there will be a way out of this problem. Thank you very much. Salamat kaayo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dular. And now let's proceed to Moses Alcala. You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I will now talk about geologic hazards that would be associated with this project. Um, and what I would like to present are things that are potentially hazardous or that could happen, and cause adverse effects to the environment and the people and the structures along the coastline of Dumaguete. But these are potential. And what I'm saying is, it doesn't necessarily have to happen. So let's start with the first slide. This is a picture of the reclamation that was done earlier by the city. Apparently, there was no um, vigorous protest against this, and the mayor and the council pushed ahead and finished it sometime last year, I believe. By the time I was aware of this, it was around 2019. It was a little late for me to join the protest, and the only thing I could do was write an article in a newspaper. So what essentially they're going to do is they're going to extend this towards the south, as Jojo is showing us the arrow. Um, this reclamation, which they call Pantawan 3, is going to extend further south, going away from the picture, and it's got a total of next slide, Joe. The length, as you have seen in other slides before me, the total length is actually 7.2 kilometers, very long. And if you notice the white area, it's very skinny. It's a very narrow, relatively narrow area as you view it from the map. And the reason for that narrow area, I will try to explain later. Next slide. Now, this is a geomorphic feature that is specific to Dumaguete. As you can see, Dumaguete is between the orange and the yellow arrows, and it is like located in the eastern corner of Negros Island. And if you notice, it is not a bay. It is not protected. Unlike Bais Bay, which you can see further to the north of us, and Bayawan Bay, which is to the south of us, Dumaguete is similar to what I call headland in geographical or geomorphological terms. A headland juts out or projects out into the ocean, thereby um, being exposed to high energy erosional processes, waves, currents, and typhoons. Thus, we can question the logic of why reclaim a headland type of situation, and even the logic of trying to construct a major industrial harbor in Dumaguete is unwise. These arrows, you will see the yellow arrows represents the Amihan winds, which is from the north, and the orange arrow is from the Habagat winds, which attack Dumaguete left and right. So during half of the year, we're being attacked by Amihan. Usually, Amihan is from November to May, and then during the rest of the year, June up to October, we're being attacked by Habagat. Not only the waves, but if you look at the blue arrow, we are also subject to the Tanyan Strait current, which is predominantly from north going to the south. Next slide. Okay, I would like to apologize for those who are not familiar with map reading, but this is a topographic map of Dumaguete. You will see that um, offshore, beyond the shoreline, to the right of the shoreline, you will see blue lines going parallel to the shoreline. These blue lines represent contours under the water. And you will notice that up to a certain point, there are no contours to the east, to the right of the picture. And why is that? Because it is very deep. And so what I'm trying to show here is that Negros and Dumaguete has a very narrow continental shelf. The edge of the shelf is only about 250 to 450 meters from the shoreline. there is a high risk of damage of structures from earthquakes and tsunamis if you reclaim within that very narrow continental shelf, because beyond the continental shelf is a sudden drop. It's in Visayan, it's called cantilado, and the sudden drop will bring you down continental slopes, which are very deep and steep, very unstable slopes under the water, which go down into the ocean bottom, which is hundreds of feet deep. Um, the uh, the reclamation area, if you notice the previous picture, goes all the way to the bottom of the picture. So that's how long that area is and how narrow it is, and the risk of being exposed to earthquakes and tsunamis. Next slide. So let's talk about the fill material. The amount of fill material has been calculated by other people, engineer types, who say that the, uh, re- uh, the the contractor will have to deal with tens of millions of cubic meters of fill material. Where are they gonna get this from? So the logical source would be dredging rivers, and as you can see in the picture, river dredging can cause a lot of sedimentation, siltation, destroy the ecology, and cause sediments to be discharged into the river and ultimately into the ocean, and then causing pollution and problems with ecosystems and marine life. Next slide. This is dredging in the ocean, and this is going to be another source for the developer. They would typically suck out the sand and the possibly mud from the bottom of the ocean and then move it into their reclamation areas. Um, it and when they do that, they are of course disturbing the ocean. They are creating sediment plumes that would spread out into the Visayan or Bohol Sea, adversely affecting Luelas, whales, and dolphins. And we don't want that. Next slide. This is a nice, clean bird's eye view rendition of the artist, showing what a typical section of the island would look like. They have proposed some kind of lagoon in between their island and the old coastline. And this is my problem with the lagoon, because this lagoon is going to be subject to flooding, it's going to be subject to pollution and liquefaction of this area along the coastline. So whenever there's flooding, it would cause liquefaction of the soil and damage to the buildings that were not a risk previously for owners of those buildings along the coastline. Another issue that I am worried about is the Banica River. As you can see, uh, their plan is to block the mouth of the Banica River. Now, the Banica River mouth involves a very dynamic um, um, environment. The dynamism has something to do with the waves and ocean and currents, um, uh, sedimentation, deposition of sands. So when when the dynamics of a river mouth is disturbed, who knows what will happen? And one of the things that I'm worried about is flooding. If the mouth gets backed up, we would have flooding along the riverbanks. And what's along the riverbanks? The houses of the poor people. So there you go. That's going to be a problem. Next slide. So these are maps from the PHIVOLCS, the Philippine Volcanology Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, and these are what they call the geohazard maps. Already, even without reclamation, you can see on the left side map, which is the liquefaction risk map, we have a very, very high risk, and it's that red band along the coastline. So any reclamation along the coastline would most likely cause aggravation or higher risks of liquefaction. And the existing buildings along this coastline would be at risk. The rightmost map will show you the tsunami geohazard map. And in fact, if you look at the colors, the purple and the pink bands of colors show you the high risk of tsunamis between 3 to 9 meters along the coastline of the city. Next slide. This is an example of a collapsed residential structure. This was in Philadelphia, and you can see that the bulkhead, which is the structure, the fence-like structure in the foreground, has collapsed. You can see part of the landfilled material underneath the building. So this was due to liquefaction. Next slide. Another example of liquefaction, building collapse in Japan, associated with a 1964 earthquake. Next slide. This is a tectonic map of Negros. For those who are not familiar with geologic maps, all these structures you see on all the way to the left side is what we call the Negros Trench. This is a subduction trench, basically moving plates and plates that are going underneath one plate. There are volcanoes, the Cuernos de Negros being one of the extinct volcanoes based on the subduction zone. And we have a lot of faults. You can see the red dashed lines relative to Dumaguete. These lines and dashed lines represent faults that are presenting risks for earthquakes. And when we have earthquakes in Dumaguete, we can expect liquefaction, we can expect damage, direct damage to buildings, which will be a great risk for the reclamation area. Next slide. And this is just another map showing, it's a little slow coming up, earthquakes and tsunamis. Give it a few more seconds. It should come up. There you go. Okay, as you can see, all the highlighted numbers are the years, and next to them are the magnitudes of the earthquakes. And the purple bands and the green bands are areas where tsunamis are likely to occur. It still hasn't come up, but there is supposed to have been an earthquake in 1922 near Apo Island, and that earthquake caused tsunami along the southern towns of Negros, including Dumaguete. Next slide. There you go. 2012. Can you go back there, Joe? 2012, in fact, is the latest, most damaging one that happened in Tayasan. That was an earthquake that I think was caused by a collapse of the continental shelf off Tayasan. And that collapse of the continental shelf, my theory, caused the tsunami that reached 5 meters high in the town of Tayasan. Next slide. I guess that's it. Thank you very much. And the next speaker, Jenny Lynn, will go over information that she has gathered on the Polychangda Corporation, as well as other quality of life issues.
Good morning, Philippines. Good afternoon and good evening, USA and Canada. It is my honor to be with you once again to share my thoughts on the proposed reclamation of Dumaguete's coastal areas to create two artificial islands. I have heard it said that this present controversy is a mere tempest in a teacup, that whatever is brewing in our beloved city will eventually simmer down, and when all is said and done, Dumaguete will have a cool, smart city to boast of. After hearing our three eminent panelists, can we honestly accede to the notion that this is a mere tempest in a teacup? This fight that we are engaged in now is not just a tempest. Rather, it is the perfect storm. We are currently witnessing a confluence of forces that threaten the very survival and future of our beloved city if we don't act now. Golda has eloquently articulated the multifarious ways by which the city administration has intentionally cut corners to defy its own ordinances, violate the Constitution and national laws, and totally disregard the people's inherent right to be heard before any contract is signed. Luella and Moses are experts on marine resources conservation and environmental geology, have illustrated in no uncertain terms the irreparable damage it will inflict on Dumaguete's marine ecosystem and terrestrial and subterranean resources. Life in Dumaguete, as we know it, will forever be changed if we allow the mayor and his enablers to get their way. But there is another compelling reason why we cannot afford to just sit on the fence with regard to this raging controversy. I am concerned that this reclamation project poses a threat to our internal security. It is of public knowledge that while EM Cuerpo is the unsolicited proponent, it does not have the capability to finance and execute such a large-scale project. So why would Cuerpo even dare to offer an unsolicited proposal to the mayor on November 25, 2019? The extant records reveal that 8 months prior to that unsolicited proposal, or as early as April 29, 2019, EM Cuerpo and Polychangda Overseas Engineering Company Limited had already entered into a memorandum of understanding. The specific purpose of the MOU was for EM Cuerpo to accept Polychangda's offer, meaning it was Polychangda which made the original offer, to EM Cuerpo to assist and submit a proposal to EM Cuerpo for reclamation and construction works for the Dumaguete project. And number two, to undertake the subcontract works for the project. However, EM Cuerpo did not mention in its unsolicited proposal the role of Polychangda. Why? Because both parties agreed in the MOU to keep all information made available to themselves or anyone representing them confidential. This in itself is a gross violation of the public-private partnership guidelines. But who or what is Polychangda? While it is readily seen that it is based in Guangzhou, China, the details of its operations and management is a tightly guarded secret. To get to its core identity and organizational structure, one needs to peel its cover layer by layer. Recent investigative journalism has, however, exposed some very disturbing facts. Polychangda is only one of hundreds of subsidiaries under the umbrella of the China Poly Group Corporation Limited. The Poly Group is a state-owned enterprise which is under the supervision and management of China's Asset Supervision and Administration Commission of the State Council. The Poly Group was founded in 1992 upon approval of the State Council and, take note, the Central Military Commission of the People's Republic of China. It is in turn a subsidiary of China International Trust and Investment Corporation, or the CITIC. In a 1997 report by the global think tank RAND Corporation, the CITIC is called a front company of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In a 2013 study conducted by Kane Nuns of the Global Post, the Poly Group was also labeled as the most important company you have never heard of. Recently, it has been mainly known for Poly Technologies, which is China's biggest exporter of arms to war zones in Sudan and Zimbabwe. It also exports arms to troubled spots such as Myanmar to pave the way for resource extraction projects by its subsidiaries. In 1996, the Poly Group came under public scrutiny and sanction for illegally importing 2,000 AK-47 assault rifles into the United States. As for its leadership structure, the president and honorary chairman of the Poly Group, He Ping, is a former major general in the People's Liberation Army. The company itself is top-heavy with former high-ranking PLA officers. So why would this Chinese military-controlled Poly Group, through its subsidiary Poly Changda, be interested in undertaking this reclamation project in a third-class city that is Dumaguete? The answer to that question is in the inherent features of Negros Island and Dumaguete City. Negros Island is centrally located in the Philippine archipelago, and it is bounded strategically by 4 bodies of water. On the west by Guimaras Strait, on the north by the Visayan Sea, on the south by the Sulu Sea, and on the east by Tanyan Strait. 4 waterways that are convenient for ingress and egress by surface vessels. Tanyan Strait, in particular, is just a pebble's throw away from where the 2 islands will be built. It is very deep and hence hospitable for navigation by underwater and submarine vessels. So what if the Chinese owners of 49% of the islands clandestinely build a submarine dock there? We already know the dismal incapacity of our own Navy and Coast Guard to police our seas. The Chinese Navy, on the other hand, is already occupying artificial islands in the West Philippine Sea. So why would we roll out the red carpet for them, leading right onto our doorstep? Another reason that makes Dumaguete and its coastal resources a desirable target for the Chinese military is the fact that it has redundant fiber optic lines, which is a focal point for the telecommunications industry. It is identified by the Philippine government as the landing point for submarine fiber optic and power cables connecting it to the rest. I'm so sorry about that. I'm so sorry about that.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, now. So let me just go over that same paragraph, okay? Another reason that makes Dumaguete and its coastal resources a desirable target for the Chinese military is the fact that it has redundant fiber optic lines, which is a focal point for telecommunications industry. It is identified by the Philippine government as the landing point for submarine fiber optic and power cables connecting it to the rest of the country. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? We already know that when state-owned Chinese construction companies descend on poorer and vulnerable countries, they never leave. That has been the painful and ongoing experience of our Asian neighbors, even as far as India and in the STAN countries in Europe. But we don't even have to look that far. In Cavite and other parts of the country, the Chinese invasion is well underway. They call it an invasion by investment. And because the Chinese are also the financiers, we will be eternally buried in its debt trap. So, in closing, allow me to acknowledge the efforts of Attorney Golda Benjamin. She is the brave face and voice of the opposition. More than anyone else, she has conscientiously and selflessly exposed the glaring flaws of the city administration. While we can shout physically and virtually no to 174, she is the one who enlightens us on why we must say no now and act on it. But let me tell you that Golda stands on the shoulders of dedicated volunteers, groups, and individuals, the young and the not so young, professionals and students, and grassroots organizations who equally believe in this just cause. She and the other people working with her need our support and prayers as this battle continues. We need to prevent this catastrophe from ever happening. The writing is on the wall, but City Hall is playing deaf, dumb, and blind. Our unequivocal opposition is a very powerful tool, not only to effect change for the greater good, but also to fight corruption and ineptitude in government service. Your four panelists, all alumni, stand in solidarity with Silliman University in opposing this reclamation project. As the president of the I call on alumni everywhere to carefully discern the information and misinformation available out there. If you find that this proposed reclamation is not true to the mayor's promise of prosperity and security, please, please register your opposition. Thank you and daghang salamat.